Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that your country no longer exists. Not because of war, not because of natural disaster, but because 14 men in suits, sitting in a room thousands of miles away, decided to draw lines on a map. Lines that cut through your village, separated your family, and declared that half of you now belong to one nation and half to another. You had no say in it. You weren't consulted. You weren't even invited to the room where it happened. This isn't science fiction. This is what occurred to an entire continent in the winter of 1884, and the scars of that decision are still bleeding today. On a cold November morning in 1884, the most powerful men in Europe gathered in a palatial building in Berlin. Outside, snow dusted the cobblestones. Inside, champagne flowed and cigars burned as these men prepared to do something unprecedented in human history. They were about to divide an entire continent among themselves. Not through conquest, not through negotiation with the people who lived there, but through what they called diplomacy. The conference would last 104 days. When it ended, Africa would never be the same. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. No African was present in that room. Not a single representative from the kingdoms, empires, and societies that had existed for centuries on that continent had a seat at the table where their fate was being decided. The Sultan of Zanzibar tried to attend. His request was dismissed without discussion. This wasn't just colonialism. This was something far more insidious. This was the systematic erasure of identity on a continental scale. To understand what happened in Berlin, we need to go back to a time when Africa was still largely a mystery to Europeans. The maps of the 1800s showed vast blank spaces across the interior of the continent, marked with phrases like terra incognita, unknown land. Europeans had been trading along the African coasts for centuries, building forts and trading posts, but the interior remained impenetrable. Malaria killed European explorers at horrifying rates. Out of every 1,000 Europeans who ventured into tropical Africa before the mid-1800s, between 250 and 500 would die, most from diseases they had no immunity to. Africa wasn't the dark continent because it lacked civilization. It was dark to Europeans because they simply couldn't survive there long enough to explore it. The continent had its own defense mechanism, and it worked brilliantly. But then, something changed. In the 1840s, European scientists discovered that quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree found in highland Peru, could treat malaria. Death rates plummeted. For the first time in history, Europeans could venture into the African interior and expect to come back alive. This was the first domino. The second was the steam engine. Steamboats could now navigate Africa's rivers, opening up trade routes that had been impossible before. The third was metallurgy. New techniques for producing iron led to cheaper, more effective weapons. The Maxim gun, a semi-automatic machine gun, became the standard weapon of European forces in Africa. It was light, fast, and devastatingly effective. With these three technological advances, the balance of power shifted dramatically. What had been impossible for centuries suddenly became not just possible, but easy, frighteningly easy. David Livingstone became a household name across Europe. A Scottish missionary and explorer, he ventured into Africa in 1840 with a mission that he summed up in 3 words: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. He was the first to demonstrate that quinine was the key to surviving Africa's disease environment. His explorations of the Congo River between 1874 and 1877 removed the last blank spaces from European maps. He sent back reports of vast resources, untapped wealth, and what he saw as people in desperate need of salvation. His accounts reached European capitals at exactly the wrong time, or perhaps from Africa's perspective, the worst possible time. Europe was in the grip of a long economic depression. Factories were overproducing, consumption was down, and industrialists were desperate for new markets. Africa, Livingstone's report suggested, was the answer. Not the real Africa, with its complex societies and established trade networks, but the Africa of European imagination, a vast, untapped reservoir of markets, resources, and investment opportunities waiting to be exploited. But the spark that would ignite the scramble came from an unexpected source. Leopold II, King of Belgium, was obsessed with empire. Belgium was a small country, and Leopold felt it deserved, or rather he deserved, a colonial possession to rival those of Britain and France. In 1876, he founded the International African Association, which sounded like a humanitarian organization dedicated to ending slavery and bringing civilization to Africa. It was, in reality, a front for Leopold's personal ambitions. He hired Henry Morton Stanley, the famous journalist and explorer who had uttered the immortal words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," upon finding the missing missionary, to help him stake a claim in the Congo. Between 1879 and 1882, Stanley traveled up and down the Congo River, establishing trading posts and persuading local chiefs to sign treaties. These treaties, many of which later altered to Leopold's benefit, gave away rights to land and resources that the chiefs didn't understand they were signing away. The chiefs thought they were making pacts of friendship. Stanley knew they were signing away their sovereignty. At the same time, a French-Italian naval officer named Pierre de Brazza was also in the Congo Basin, signing similar treaties on behalf of France. He founded Brazzaville in 1880, giving France what it saw as a gateway to the heart of Africa. The Portuguese, who had maintained a presence in Africa since the 15th century through their relationship with the Kingdom of Congo, felt their historic claims were being ignored. Britain, already in control of Egypt and South Africa, watched nervously as its rivals staked claims. And then Germany entered the game. Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, had been skeptical about colonies, but by 1884, he grew frustrated with British behavior in Africa and worried that Germany would be left out entirely. In a span of months between May 1884 and February 1885, Germany claimed territory in what is now Namibia, Togo, and Cameroon. Europe was on the brink of war over African territory, and the inhabitants of the continent had no idea what was coming.
This is where Berlin enters the story. Bismarck, concerned that competition over Africa would destabilize Europe, called for an international conference to establish rules for the conquest and partition of Africa. Think about that for a moment. Rules for conquest. The conference convened on November 15, 1884. 14 nations attended: Germany, France, Great Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Russia, Turkey, and the United States. The United States was invited because of its interest in Liberia, but chose not to ratify the final agreement, wanting no part in building a colonial empire in Africa. What's striking about this list is not just who was there, but who wasn't. No African kingdom was invited. No African ruler had a voice. The conference was dressed up with humanitarian language about abolishing slavery and protecting the welfare of African peoples, but the agenda was almost purely economic. A week before the conference closed, a newspaper in Lagos, Nigeria, declared that the world had perhaps never witnessed a robbery on so large a scale. The conference lasted until February 26, 1885, with a break for Christmas and New Year. In those 104 days, the attending nations established what they called the General Act, a document that would govern European behavior in Africa. But here's what makes the General Act so insidious. It didn't actually partition Africa. That's a common misconception. What it did was far worse. It established the rules by which Africa could be partitioned. The conference laid out the principle of effective occupation, which stated that a European power could only acquire rights over African land if it possessed it, had treaties with local leaders, flew its flag there, and established an administration with a police force. In other words, you couldn't just claim territory, you had to actually take it. This turned Africa into a race. European powers scrambled to sign treaties, plant flags, and establish administrations before their rivals could. The scramble had officially begun. The only territory that came directly out of the Berlin Conference was the Congo Free State, which was recognized as the personal property of King Leopold II. Not a Belgian colony, but Leopold's private possession. An area roughly one-third the size of the continental United States, home to millions of people, was given to one man. What happened next in the Congo would become one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Leopold never set foot in Africa. He ruled the Congo from Brussels through a private army called the Force Publique, made up of African soldiers led by European officers. The Congo was extraordinarily rich in natural resources: ivory, palm oil, timber, and especially rubber, which became hugely valuable in the 1890s with the rise of the automobile industry. Leopold's administration extracted these resources through a system of forced labor that was brutal beyond imagination. Congolese people were forced to meet rubber quotas. If they failed, the punishment was swift and horrifying. Hands were cut off, entire villages were burned. Women and children were taken hostage to force men to work. The Force Publique soldiers had to prove they hadn't wasted bullets by bringing back the severed hands of those they killed. Sometimes they cut off hands of living people to meet the quota when ammunition ran out during hunts. The accounts that emerged from the Congo shocked the world. George Washington Williams, an American historian and journalist who traveled to the Congo in 1890, wrote an open letter to Leopold describing the suffering he witnessed. He called the practices crimes against humanity, one of the first uses of that phrase. Joseph Conrad, the Polish-British novelist, visited the Congo between 1890 and 1894 and wrote what he saw in Heart of Darkness, which became a bestseller and brought international attention to the atrocities in the Congo. British journalist Edmund de Morel launched a campaign through his magazine and speaking tours, using photographs of mutilated victims provided by missionaries to tell the story of horror in the Congo. The images were unbearable. Children with their hands cut off, villages destroyed, bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Morel founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904, one of the first large-scale human rights organizations. The pressure mounted. Even Mark Twain wrote a satirical pamphlet, King Leopold's Soliloquy, that included biting cartoons showing the king's hypocrisy. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote The Crime of the Congo, which was widely read. The international outcry eventually forced the Belgian government to take control of the Congo from Leopold in 1908, but the damage was done. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that between 5 and 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's rule, roughly half the population. Some call it genocide. Others argue it wasn't intentional, but rather the collateral damage of a rapacious system of exploitation. Either way, it was a slaughter on a staggering scale. But the Congo was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. While the world's attention was focused on Leopold's atrocities, the rest of Africa was being carved up with the same callous disregard for the people who lived there. Following the rules established at Berlin, European powers raced across the continent, signing treaties, planting flags, and establishing administrations before their rivals could. The British moved from Egypt in the north and South Africa in the south, creating a continuous band of British territory that was only interrupted by German East Africa. They claimed Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and vast stretches of land in between. The French extended their rule from Senegal deep into Central Africa, creating French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. Portugal took control of Angola and Mozambique. Germany claimed Tanganyika, now Tanzania, along with its territories in West Africa. Italy took Eritrea and Somalia. Spain held small territories in the northwest and on the Atlantic coast. By 1914, 90% of Africa had been divided among 7 European countries. Only 2 nations remained independent: Ethiopia, which had defeated Italian invaders at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Liberia, which had strong historical connections to the United States. Now here's where the true tragedy of identity erasure becomes clear. The borders drawn by Europeans had nothing to do with the African societies that existed on the ground. Nothing. The Europeans drew straight lines on maps using rulers, often following rivers or arbitrary coordinates. They didn't consider the kingdoms, empires, ethnic groups, or cultural regions that had existed for centuries. The Maasai people found themselves split between British Kenya and German Tanganyika.
The Yoruba kingdom was divided between British Nigeria and French Dahomey. The Somali people were scattered across British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and Ethiopia. The Bakongo people, whose kingdom had once been powerful and unified, were split among French Congo, Belgian Congo, and Portuguese Angola. Imagine your family, your community, your entire cultural identity suddenly bisected by an invisible line that determined which foreign power controlled you. On one side, your brother spoke French and lived under French law,
British law. But you were the same people. You shared the same ancestors, the same traditions, the same stories. The border was meaningless to you, but it was everything to the colonial powers. African societies did not submit quietly to this division. Resistance was fierce, creative, and persistent. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia understood the threat and acted decisively. He imported weapons, modernized his army, and when Italy invaded in 1896, he crushed them at the Battle of Adwa, one of the most significant African victories against European colonialism. Ethiopia remained independent, a beacon of what was possible. But Menelik's success was the exception. Most African societies, no matter how fiercely they fought, were overwhelmed by European military superiority. Samori Touré, who ruled the Mandinka Empire in West Africa, fought the French for nearly 2 decades using guerrilla tactics and scorched earth strategies. He was finally captured in 1898 after destroying his own agricultural base to deny it to the enemy, leaving his people starving. The Zulu in South Africa initially defeated the British at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, killing over 1,300 British soldiers. But the British returned with reinforcements and eventually destroyed the Zulu kingdom. The Maji Maji Rebellion in German East Africa in 1905 saw Africans from different ethnic groups unite against German forced cotton cultivation. The Germans suppressed the rebellion by destroying fields and food stores, causing a famine that killed hundreds of thousands. Other societies tried different strategies. Some rulers collaborated with Europeans, hoping to preserve their power within the colonial structure. In northern Nigeria, the Sokoto Caliphate eventually forged an alliance with British colonial authorities, allowing the caliphate to maintain authority over its subjects in exchange for accepting British oversight. This system, called indirect rule, let traditional rulers keep their positions as long as they enforced colonial policies. It was a Faustian bargain, power in exchange for complicity. The Buganda Kingdom in present-day Uganda actively helped the British subjugate rival kingdoms in exchange for a favored position within the colonial protectorate. Bugandan elites provided military and political support, crushing their neighbors to secure their own survival under British protection. It worked in the sense that Buganda maintained more autonomy than other regions, but it also meant participating in the subjugation of fellow Africans. And in areas with no central authority, resistance was even more complicated. The Igbo of southern Nigeria had no paramount chief who could surrender. The British had to defeat countless village groups one by one. It took until 1910 for the British to declare victory, and even then, resistance continued for years. The Europeans also used a devastating tactic, exploiting local rivalries. When African kingdoms didn't unite against the invaders, the Europeans picked them off one by one. The British fought the Yoruba, then the Kingdom of Benin, then the Sokoto Caliphate, all separately. The French made treaties with both the Tukler and Mandinka empires, promising peace, and then attacked both after playing them against each other. In Angola, the Portuguese let African armies do their fighting, pitting groups against one another, and it took until well into the 20th century before Portugal could claim full control. The strategy was as old as empire itself: divide and conquer. but rarely had it been executed on such a vast scale with such devastating efficiency. African societies were not unified. They had their own conflicts, their own histories of warfare and alliance. The Europeans weaponized these divisions. What's particularly cruel about the partition is that many of the treaties used to justify European claims were fundamentally dishonest. African chiefs signed documents thinking they were pacts of friendship or trade agreements. The documents were in languages they couldn't read. Even when interpreters were present, the full implications weren't explained. A chief might agree to protection without understanding that meant surrendering sovereignty. Or he might grant trading rights without realizing he was signing away ownership of all land and resources. These treaties were then taken back to Europe and used as legal justification for colonial occupation. Karl Peters signed treaties with African chiefs on behalf of Germany, and in 1885, Germany declared a protectorate over Tanganyika based on those documents. Similar processes occurred across the continent. It was a legal fiction built on deception, but it was enough to satisfy the effective occupation principle established at Berlin. The treaties provided a veneer of legitimacy to what was, in essence, theft on a continental scale. By 1914, the partition was essentially complete. Looking at a map of Africa from that year is like looking at a jigsaw puzzle assembled by someone with no regard for the picture on the pieces. Straight lines cut across landscapes. Borders ignored rivers, mountains, and cultural regions. The British held a continuous strip from Cairo to Cape Town. The French controlled vast swaths of West and Central Africa. The Portuguese held Angola and Mozambique on opposite coasts. The Belgians had the Congo. The Germans had territories in the west, southwest, and east until World War I stripped them away. Italy had Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. Spain held small corners. And through all this, not a single African voice had been heard in determining how the continent would be divided. The Lagos Observer had been right. This was robbery on a scale the world had never witnessed. But the story doesn't end in 1914. The consequences of the partition would reverberate for more than a century. When African nations finally began achieving independence in the 1950s and 1960s, they faced an impossible choice. The colonial borders made no sense. They grouped together ethnic groups with no shared history and divided groups that had been unified for centuries. They created countries with no natural economic coherence, cutting off regions from their traditional trade routes and resources. The logical thing would have been to redraw the borders along lines that reflected African realities rather than European convenience. But doing so would have meant potential conflict between newly independent nations, each claiming territory from the other. It would have risked throwing the continent into chaos. So, at a meeting of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, African leaders made a fateful decision. They agreed to keep the colonial borders. They called it the principle of uti possidetis, a Latin phrase meaning as you possess. Whatever borders you had at independence, those would be your permanent borders. It was pragmatic. It was necessary to prevent wars of partition. But it also meant that the arbitrary lines drawn in Berlin would define African nations for generations to come.
The consequences of this decision are still playing out today. Rwanda and Burundi provide perhaps the most tragic example. Before colonization, the people in this region did not think of themselves primarily as Hutu or Tutsi. These were fluid social categories based on wealth and cattle ownership, and individuals could move between them. The Germans and later the Belgians, who took control after World War I, rigidified these categories. They issued identity cards classifying everyone as either Hutu or Tutsi, measuring noses and skulls in pseudo-scientific attempts to determine which group was superior. The Belgians decided the Tutsi were racially superior and should rule, giving them privileged positions in the colonial administration. This created deep resentment among the Hutu majority. When Rwanda gained independence in 1962, the Hutu overthrew Tutsi rule, and tensions simmered for decades. In 1994, those tensions exploded in genocide. In 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people were murdered. The genocide had many causes, including political manipulation and economic stress. But its roots lay in the colonial system that had created and enforced ethnic divisions that hadn't existed in such rigid form before. The Berlin Conference didn't directly cause the Rwandan genocide, but it set in motion the processes that made it possible. Nigeria offers another example of the long-term consequences of arbitrary borders. The British cobbled together more than 300 ethnic groups into a single colony, grouping the predominantly Muslim North with the Christian and animist South, regions that had little shared history and vastly different governance systems. When Nigeria gained independence in 1960, it immediately faced challenges of national unity. How do you create a cohesive nation out of such diversity, especially when that diversity was forced upon you by colonial powers? Nigeria has struggled with regional tensions, religious conflicts, and separatist movements ever since. The Biafran War from 1967 to 1970, in which the southeastern region attempted to secede, resulted in over 1 million deaths, many from starvation. The conflict was rooted in the colonial legacy. Different regions, different peoples, all forced into one nation by British administrators who never considered whether they wanted to be united. Former Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere captured this dilemma perfectly when he said, "We have artificial nations carved out at the Berlin Conference in 1884, and today we are struggling to build these nations into stable units of human society. We are in danger of becoming the most balkanized continent in the world." The economic consequences have been equally devastating. The colonial borders created landlocked nations cut off from the sea, like Chad, Mali, Niger, and the Central African Republic, making trade expensive and development difficult. They separated regions from their natural trade partners. They grouped together areas with no economic complementarity. And they ensured that the economic infrastructure built during colonial times, the roads, railroads, and ports, were designed to extract resources for export to Europe rather than to promote internal trade and development within Africa. When African nations gained independence, they inherited economies structured for exploitation, not for the benefit of their own people. Changing that structure has been the work of decades and remains incomplete in many countries. There's also a psychological dimension to the partition that's harder to measure, but no less real. When your identity, your culture, your history is denied and suppressed for generations, when you're told that your traditional ways are backward and inferior, when your languages are forbidden in schools and your religions are suppressed in favor of Christianity, something profound is lost. The partition of Africa wasn't just about drawing borders. It was about imposing a view of the world in which Europeans were superior and Africans were inferior. This ideology, which flourished between 1880 and 1920, justified everything from the Berlin Conference to Leopold's atrocities. It told Africans that they needed to be civilized, that they needed to be saved from themselves. And even after independence, that psychological legacy lingered. In many African countries, speaking the colonial language, French or English or Portuguese, is still a marker of education and status. Traditional religions are often seen as primitive compared to Christianity or Islam. African history before colonization is sometimes dismissed as less important than the colonial period. This is the deep wound of the partition. It's not just that borders were drawn badly, it's that an entire continent was told its identity didn't matter. But here's what the men in Berlin didn't count on. Identity is resilient. Culture is resilient. People are resilient.
Despite everything, despite the partition, despite the violence, despite decades of colonial rule, African identities survived. Languages continued to be spoken in homes even when they were banned in schools. Traditional religions adapted and persisted alongside Christianity and Islam. Stories and histories were passed down through generations orally when they couldn't be written down. And when independence came, there was an explosion of cultural renaissance across the continent. Writers like Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o told African stories in ways that honored African perspectives. Musicians blended traditional sounds with modern instruments, creating new genres that spread around the world. Artists drew on traditional motifs and contemporary experiences to create works that spoke to both African and universal themes. The partition of Africa tried to erase African identity, but it failed. Today, more than a century after the Berlin Conference, Africa is still dealing with its legacy, but it's also moving beyond it. The African Union, founded in 2001 as a successor to the Organization of African Unity, works to promote unity and cooperation across the continent. Regional economic communities like the East African Community and the Economic Community of West African States are working to make colonial borders less relevant by promoting free movement and trade. There are calls for border adjustments in some cases, and while such changes remain politically difficult, the conversation is happening. Young Africans, connected through technology and social media, are forging Pan-African identities that transcend the colonial boundaries. They're reclaiming their histories, celebrating their cultures, and building futures that aren't defined by what happened in Berlin in 1884. But we can't move forward without understanding what happened. The Berlin Conference and the partition of Africa represent one of history's greatest injustices. An entire continent was carved up by outsiders with no input from the people who lived there. Identities were erased, societies were destroyed, and borders were drawn that would cause conflicts for generations. The consequences are still with us. Every time you hear about a conflict in Africa described as ancient tribal hatreds, remember that many of those divisions were created or exacerbated by colonial powers. Every time you see a map of Africa with its straight-line borders, remember that those lines were drawn in Berlin by men who had never set foot in the interior of the continent. Every time you wonder why African development has been so difficult, remember that the economic and political structures inherited from colonialism were designed for exploitation, not for the benefit of African peoples. The story of the Berlin Conference is not just African history, it's world history. It's a story about power and what happens when those with power feel entitled to make decisions for those without it. It's a story about the long-term consequences of short-term greed. It's a story about the resilience of human identity in the face of systematic attempts to erase it. And it's a story that continues to unfold. The men who gathered in Berlin in 1884 thought they were dividing Africa permanently among themselves. They thought they were bringing civilization to a dark continent. They thought they were securing Europe's future prosperity. They were wrong on all counts. What they actually did was set in motion one of history's greatest crimes, a crime whose effects we're still grappling with today. So the next time you look at a map of Africa, see it not just as a collection of countries, but as a testament to resilience. See the borders not as permanent features of the landscape, but as scars from a historical wound. And remember that before those borders existed, before those men gathered in Berlin, Africa was a continent of kingdoms and empires, of diverse peoples and rich cultures, of complex societies and ancient traditions. That Africa still exists beneath the partition. It exists in the languages people speak, the stories they tell, the music they create, and the identities they maintain despite everything. The men in Berlin tried to erase it. They failed. And in that failure lies a profound truth. You cannot erase people's identity by drawing lines on a map. You can suppress it, you can deny it, you can try to replace it with something else. But it endures, it survives, it persists. That is the real story of the partition of Africa. Not the story of what Europe took, but the story of what Africa kept, despite everything. And that's a story worth remembering.